When the nation is on fire, you can count on the Constitution and the states it serves. The wisdom of the Founding Fathers came not from within, but from the Creator Himself. We are here today to seek His wisdom and His guidance in restoring the freedoms He granted to all of us. Join us today in the battle for your faith, your family, and your future. This is the truth.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 3 of The Truth with Steve Hopkins and John Williams. I'm John Williams, and you'll notice that I'm minus Steve Hopkins. Steve is on vacation this week, but don't worry, you're still in the right place for hearing the unfiltered, unbridled, absolute truth. We plan on bringing that to you every week. And with Steve being out this week, we wanted to have a special guest on, and I am truly honored that we are able to have this guy on here today, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and co-founder of Restore Liberty, Colonel Darin Gaub. Darin, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks, John. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and see you this morning.
Well, we were talking earlier, and I want the viewers to know that, and it's sort of an inside joke. Rebecca Cheney was actually going to fill in for Steve this week, and her family is sick. And she called me and said, "Man, my husband's sick. Both of my kids are sick, and I'm afraid that when Friday rolls around, I may not be able to, I may be sick as well and not be able to do the podcast." And so she reached out to you, and I understand Rebecca is the state director, the Mississippi state director for Restore Liberty. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. She's phenomenal, as you can imagine.
She's on the board of the Mississippi Freedom Caucus with me, and so we talk a lot, and she is a true warrior for liberty, and she teaches biblical citizenship classes that she and I do, and she's in the central part of the state, and I'm up in the northern part, and she wanted me to let you know that the next time you guys have a board meeting or Zoom meeting with Restore Liberty, she was going to let everyone know that she was our first choice. You're filling in for her. So,
and inadequately so. I promise you that. For those of you who know Rebecca and have listened to her talk on any number of platforms, she's a hard act to follow for anybody, to be sure.
She is. She really is. She knows her stuff, and there's no doubt about that. So I understand that you had a career in the Army for, 28 years? I think Rebecca told me. What did you do when you were in the Army?
Well, I started out enlisted, actually. I was kind of was a part of that Rambo wave, I guess you could say. Everybody wants to go out and do Rambo stuff, so I enlisted in the infantry. And then after a while said, well, this is not as fun as Rambo because, and got out and went back to college here in Montana. And I was going to go into business and pursue something along those lines. And that was the beginning of making plans and God laughing at me and saying, no, I got something else for you. And I went into ROTC, became an officer. I got commissioned into Army Aviation and went to flight school, I learned how to fly Blackhawks, and then through a series of assignments, starting in South Korea, then all over the U.S., which turned into, basically 6 more deployments after being gone in Korea for a year, and from Eastern Europe, North Africa, 4 years in Afghanistan. It's almost 3 years training units in Fort Irwin, California at the National Training Center, and multiple other things. It all added up to from 1991 to 2019 with some active National Guard and more active time. Me saying, you know what, I think I'm done. God has something for me. I don't know what it is.
Right.
Came back to Montana to never leave the state, to be left alone, to not do anything that required any kind of stress or anything like that. And again, made plans, and that was my first mistake.
Yeah, well, I've been down that road before. So I guess God had a different plan, huh?
Yeah, he always does. And, my kids, daughter, son-in-law, son, both sets of parents. I mean, everybody's in Montana right now. My brother's retired Air Force, just got back to Montana from Maryland. And so we're all here in Montana. And to pursue a military career that had a limited ceiling on it, just due to my personality more than anything else.
Right.
and be in North Carolina in this case, rather than being where all of my family is in Montana. It just
Right.
didn't seem like the right thing to do with our time, with being an empty nest. There was much more to life than that.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I know I mentioned that you were the co-founder of Restore Liberty, but if you don't mind, I want to set that aside for a minute, because I'd like to come back to that, and I want to learn more about Restore Liberty and have you tell everyone that watches the podcast about Restore Liberty. But I want to start with a subject that just kind of touched my heart this week. I was reading an article about the separation of the church and state, and I did something very profound in trying to learn more about that concept of church and state. And this is going to blow your mind. I hope you're sitting down when I reveal this to you. I decided the best place to start would be to actually read the First Amendment.
That's crazy.
Imagine that. I know, right? So, there's all this confusion around this constitutional issue of the separation of church and state. And one reason it's so confusing is because it's not in the Constitution. So I went and read the First Amendment, and it says here, and I just want to show this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So if this is talking about freedom of religion, this is addressing Congress specifically. Where did this whole separation of church and state idea come from to begin with?
Well, yeah, and that's 1947 really is the first, I guess, bridge that was crossed to talk about the separation of church and state, when in Everson versus Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black reinvented that phrase of the separation of church and state, and the wall that separated those two based on language from Thomas Jefferson that had nothing to do with any kind of legal precedence. And this really began the process of basing legal precedence on sand versus solid rock. It's like the biblical example of building your house on the sand versus a solid rock scenario. And so he invented this out of nothing, really. Thomas Jefferson had no intention whatsoever of saying that there was ever to be this wall of separation between the two that created a situation where all religion was removed from public life, no matter what, as long as the government was involved in any way, shape, or form. And so that was the first reinventing, I guess you could say, of that wheel. Hugo Black was the one who did it. And now that everybody's leaning on that particular ruling, it's kind of like Roe versus Wade. When a right is invented out of nothing, it also rests on nothing, and eventually it has to come down. And will it happen? I don't know, but it will not be done by human hands.
So I ran across the same information that you're saying, that this was lifted from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association like 12 years after the Constitution was ratified.
Yeah.
And I made a post about this earlier on Facebook, and someone said, well, Thomas Jefferson meant, he included the concept of the separation of church and state in the writing of the Constitution. And I laughed because when the Constitution was written, Thomas Jefferson was serving as the Secretary of State in Paris. He wasn't even in the States when they were debating these amendments. He had zero input on the First Amendment. I mean, it wasn't like you could, send a tweet or a text and tell him, what he thought. And so what you have here is you have an Alabama Supreme Court justice in 1947, who, by the way, was a Democrat and a KKK member, who wrote the majority opinion on this court case, not based on the Constitution, not based on the Declaration of Independence, not based on any statute or codified law, but from a letter. One line of a letter is what has removed prayer from school and everything else. And I just don't get that. I mean, that's crazy that we've put up with that.
Well, and that's I guess you could say, very clearly the evidence that we need that this is proof of the agenda was what was being pursued, not the truth. I mean, imagine if you wrote a letter from yourself to some friends advocating for something, and some random justice in a corner of the country picked up that letter and turned it into precedents for law that could remake the face of a nation, and all you were doing was just trying to send a letter to your friends.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, it didn't happen until what, 150 years after he wrote the letter.
Oh yeah, the jurisprudence on this held in place for a long time. It took 3 months, by the way. Obviously, he was overseas, so the letter he got, it took him 3 months to where it was able to be considered a reply. Right. And he expanded upon that again throughout some more of his life. But I mean, the bottom line is 52 of the 56 signers would be considered evangelical in some nature. And, the College of New Jersey, which would later become Princeton, and most of these colleges were built to train pastors. Mm-hmm. And so it's a complete ignorance of American history to be able to reach back in time and say that all of this stuff was secular, that this isn't a Christian foundation nation. That ignores way too much of history. And of course, was it done perfectly? Of course not.
Well, that's what the amendment process is for. If we don't get it right or something changes, like, prohibition, perfect example. Alcoholism was running rampant in the U.S. I can understand at the time why we did that and why the people did that, but then they realized, 9-10 years later that, hey, maybe we went too far and need to, circle back and do things differently. But so the problem that I have with this is, you look at the baker and that refused to bake the cake for the gay couple. And so, if we look at this wording, it said that we shall make no law. And if you skip the, respecting an establishment of the religion, but you talk about prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So for the lady baking the cake, the free exercise of her religion was the fact that she had a religious problem with gay marriage. Now, whether I agree with that or you agree with that or not is irrelevant. That's how she believed. And to ask her to try to force her to do something against her religious belief is prohibiting the free exercise of her belief. And it seems to me that religion, one's core belief system, is really the root of our liberty.
Yeah, and in fact, some of the original language, I guess when they started drafting the Bill of Rights and the amendments that would go in there, the freedom of religion aspect of this was number 3, not number 1, and it eventually turned into what it is now. But some of the original language actually included the fact that you're supposed to be free of violations of personal conscience, and that's pretty clear too. It's kind of like the Second Amendment where it says "shall not be infringed." Now, I would say that the First Amendment and the freedom of religion is still extraordinarily clear, and that's not really open to debate.
Sure.
And this wall of separation between church and state, of course, that has been misconstrued for a couple hundred years. Let's just put that number out there. That was designed to prevent the federal government from establishing a state or a national or federal denomination for the entire country to adopt. And our knowledge of history would tell us that the reason why they did that was because the people that were leaving to come to America had suffered under the thumb of the Anglican Church, for one example, as a mandatory worship that was pushed by the British Empire at the time. I mean, it included imprisonment and all kinds of different things. They didn't want to see that again. So there was not going to be a national church at the federal level that they were going to push. But interestingly enough, they didn't say anything about the states themselves deciding for themselves what they wanted to do. In fact, 11 of the 13 states had established churches within their state governments at the time all this was going on. I don't think you can make the two connections and say that the federal government meant, or Thomas Jefferson meant, or any of this, that what we're talking about is true about the separation of church and state, given that the states already had established churches in the first place.
Well, right. Yeah, exactly. And it's another interesting thing that I find is that, firsts are important. When someone, a firstborn child, your first home, your first car, and they chose to put this first. And so I started thinking about this. And if you go and look at Genesis and Exodus, the first recorded sin in the Bible was when Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they dishonored their heavenly Father. The second sin recorded in the Bible was when Cain murdered Abel. So you fast forward to Exodus 20, and the first commandment is to honor your father and your mother. And the second commandment is thou shalt not commit murder. So I don't find it ironic at all that the 10 commandments are in that order. I think God knew exactly what he was doing. And I think it's interesting that the first two amendments are protecting religious freedom because of, like you said, the nationalized church over in England. They were required to be Church of England, as well as the Second Amendment. They wanted to be able to worship who they wanted to, and then they wanted to be able to defend themselves if anybody tried to infringe upon that. Because and here's the thing: you talk about the separation of church and state. Explain to me how you do this. If I'm a devout Christian or even a devout Muslim, right? Pick your religion. It doesn't matter. What this separation of church and state doctrine is asking me to do is it's asking me to be a good, devout Christian, Muslim, whatever, when I'm at home. But then when I leave and I go to work or school or to a high school football game or in public, I can no longer be that devout Christian. I have to set that aside. And if you're talking about religion, that is one's core beliefs. How do you separate and all of a sudden become a non-Christian or an atheist, but you're a Christian at home? That just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Oh, it's impossible. It's who govern. Let's just use people voting in Congress and Senate, for example. Which one of those separates what they consider to be their conscience from their vote? Ever.
Right.
People talk about how you can't legislate morality. Well, what do you think law is? It's an attempt to legislate based on a cultural definition of what is moral and what is not. It's a moral code written with punishments of some sort. And those punishments are graduated based on the type of crime committed. So this whole idea of you can't legislate morality, well, that's just a complete misnomer. Now, you can't legislate and enforce moral behavior.
Right. You can't get people to be good, but you can, create laws that encourage them to act right.
Yeah. And, yes, we're going way back to a point when our founding fathers wrote things like that this country and the way we're governed is intended for a moral Christian people.
Right.
Sure. Absolutely. But a large percentage of the population of this country is still that way. But we were talking before we came on, too, that unfortunately the church writ large across this country has abdicated a large part of their responsibility to be the predominant influence to our culture, rather than hide behind the walls and say, no, we're not supposed to engage. Well, you've got to be engaged.
Yes, you do. I mean, you can't separate your belief system from your political beliefs as well. I mean, it's just impossible to do. And the thing is like you talk about prayer in school or at a football game. And like you said, we are still predominantly a Christian nation. I was in Nicaragua a few years back helping do some missionary work with a friend of mine dealing with baseball. And I was in Grenada. And Grenada made it to the Nicaraguan version of the World Series. And baseball in Nicaragua is religion to those people. I mean, it truly is. And so the owner of the baseball team invited me and my friend to sit in his box at the World Series. And so here I am in a foreign country. And right before the game starts, they start praying. I have no idea what they're saying, but everybody's got their head bowed. So what did I do? I bowed my head. And then they played the Nicaraguan national anthem. And just like we do in America, they all stood up. They put their hand over their heart, took their hats off their head, and they stood at attention for the Nicaraguan national anthem. So what did I do? I was very appreciative of the people that were hosting me and the folks I had met in Nicaragua. So I honored their country and I saluted their flag and stood for their national anthem as well. I say that to say this: if the U.S. national team, if my son played on the U.S. national soccer team and we were playing in Saudi Arabia, and they said a Muslim prayer before the game, I would expect that. I mean, I wouldn't know what they were saying, but I wouldn't be disrespectful of their prayer. out of respect for their country and the fact that they were hosting our country in this game. So, I don't know how it violates someone's religion to hear another religion's prayer. I mean, you got the choice to not go to the football game or whatever the case may be. And yeah, I don't get it. And I don't know. And here's the thing that I like to focus on these podcasts is a lot of our people would agree with what you and I are saying, but then they say, what do we do? How, if yes, we realize this is fallacy, but how can we get involved? What can we do? Can we actually win this country back? And this is where I want to talk about Restore Liberty, because that's kind of where, the roots of Restore Liberty were founded. And tell us a little bit about Restore Liberty and what you guys do and how you do it and what you guys believe.
Oh, yeah, sounds great. And this is a challenge too, because we're the first ones that are going to stand in line and say that there are days when people ask us, what is Restore Liberty doing for the long term? And we'll just say, we don't necessarily know because we're not in charge. And that's a hard thing to say to someone who doesn't come from a faith background. So you have to choose your words carefully, as always, when you're doing it. And if I can step back real quick, one of the things one of the things I always talk about when it comes to the separation of church and state is Thomas Jefferson used that term, the wall, or a wall, which has come from other quotes in the history. But I think today I usually try to describe it more like a filter.
Right.
Where faith gets through to government, but government doesn't get through to faith.
Sort of a one-way wall.
Yeah, it's definitely a one-way wall. And, we're not supposed to check our conscience at the door whenever we go do life, and it goes from there. But yeah, Restore Liberty, it ultimately kind of started coming together in its initial form about 2.5 years ago. And God led me to start building a network of people, just people you can trust, who can rely on each other for any number of things, from something as simple to, hey, can you watch my kid, or help me at the hospital, or whatever that may be. And started really connecting across my hometown here in Helena, Montana, and then started connecting across the state. And then as you can imagine, you start talking to people who have friends in other states, and they're like, hey, we need to do this, and others. And so I started doing that. And then through a connection in Georgia, I ended up, being connected to a guy who would end up being the other co-founder of Restore Liberty, retired Brigadier General Air Force Blaine Holt. Mm-hmm. And for those who watch Newsmax, he's on there almost every morning.
I've seen him a lot.
Yeah, phenomenal human being. We make a great team. You can, two pilots, one fixed wing, one rotary wing, put in the same room, and we each try to outdo each other. He tells me that he carries my aircraft overseas. I remind him without my aircraft to carry, he wouldn't have a purpose. And it goes back and forth until 2 a.m. Then we start again at 5. But I think we both recognized the value of a network like that and figured out, what can we do with this that makes it somewhat of a more proactive approach to what's going on, rather than, in the background in case something bad happens. And came up with the title, started laying out what we wanted to be able to do with it. And part of what motivated it was he read something that my deputy director and I wrote called the Declaration of Constitutional Consent. And I know we're going to get to some of those pillars later, but we had heard too much about people saying, hey, we need a new Declaration of Independence, or we need a new Constitution. And a lot of those folks were the same kinds of people that were, maybe at home on their couch, cleaning their rifle or whatever, saying, I'm just ready for the shooting to start, which, those of us who've been in conflict for many years overseas, that's the last thing you want. Anywhere. Sure. It's a terrible thing to see. So the Declaration is really just this thing about revisits our history, what the intent of our founding fathers was, what has happened, and then it creates, we wrote out 18 different grievances similar to what was in the Declaration of Independence. And that fomented this idea of saying we need to come up with a long-term strategic plan that is intended to last decades, if we have decades, and to counter the narrative that's been done to us for, say, let's just go back to the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Let's pick a date. And the beginning of the process of the government working against the people instead of for.
Right.
And since then, what started off with a couple of us in an Airbnb in Idaho has turned into about 36 state directors. We got a 7-person executive team in multiple states across the country. And ultimately, it comes down to, we say that the 9th and 10th Amendment matter.
Absolutely.
Federalism matters. And the states are the predominant entity in this country to stand between a federal government with limited powers and the individuals whose rights are guaranteed by God, not granted by the government.
Absolutely. And you talked about the 9th and 10th Amendment. We saw a victory for the 10th Amendment in Roe versus Wade being overturned, a bill that was started here in Mississippi and that we're proud of. But it seems like we're operating under sort of a proxy fourth branch of government, being all these alphabet agencies and departments that have been created. And, how do we return the country around and right the ship, so to speak, while simultaneously operating under this sort of fourth proxy government, branch of government that we have?
Well, I would say first and foremost is you put the ultimate end of what that argument is in God's hands, not our own. And we just have to be obedient. And I know that kind of, if you're not a faith-based person, if in case someone like that is listening, which would surprise me, but I would also love it. But to be able to say something like that is not understood easily. Like, hey, it's not always up to us. Sometimes we're truly walking around in a fog, and all we're told is to keep moving forward. And we don't know where we're going. We don't know if there's anything in front of us. And God says, don't worry, I got you.
Wandering around the wilderness for 40 years.
Yep, exactly. It's happened, but we have to be willing to do that first and foremost, in acknowledging the fact that we follow in obedience and the results are His. But that doesn't mean we don't do planning, we don't do work, we don't do coordination and communications and all these kinds of things that we should be doing. So it also means that we need to band together as people of faith, as people who understand our Constitution and Declaration and where they fit in our history, and people who what we're looking for within Restore Liberty would be considered people who are good leadership within states and local areas that people can look to, even at the last minute in case things go really bad. Because there's no guarantee that it won't go really bad before potentially something really good happens again. That's possible for sure. And so in the meantime, practical steps. Again, and this is a Rebecca thing too that I basically stole from her. We wrote a thing called the Practical Tacticals. That's on our website, restore-liberty.org. And we just laid out, what can you do to help this nation fight back? And it doesn't necessarily have to be from a spiritual perspective. I think everything is, regardless, personally. But if you were to pull that up, it'd be interesting because you're looking at this list of things you can do at the local, state, and federal levels. And what I didn't anticipate was how much you could do at the local level would take up the 2.5 pages of the document compared to the other two. So it was just proof that if you're going to do something, stop worrying about the swamp of DC that is at this point virtually undrainable without something significant happening that we can't control. But what you can do is go to your city commission, your county commission, your school board. You can run for smaller offices. You can do a lot of things at your local level. And that takes up half of the document. Wow. The state is very small. The federal is even smaller, what you can do. Right. But the Democrats, the left, whatever, even unfortunately about half the Republicans, I'm not a big fan of the party side of this whole thing. We just say there's people.
Best thing can happen to the Republican Party is to die a quick death. Just go away.
Either do that or be completely revamped. I mean, I'm a county chairman here for the Republican Party in Montana, and we've completely flipped the entire county's the makeup of the entire county's Republican Central Committee. We're going to give it a chance. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But it still comes down to people. And that's what you have to do. And this is just a way of saying, if you're going to build a house again from scratch, start with the foundation and work your way up. Don't try to come from the top down.
Sure, and you mentioned earlier about the pulpit, and I saw a meme on Facebook a while back that I thought was pretty catchy, and it said, is the church shaping in society, or is society shaping the church? And I'm not talking about the individual body of Christ. I mean the physical buildings, the organizations themselves. Wish we would have used a different name for church and church. It's confusing to folks who are not believers. But you talk about rebuilding that house and not building it on sand, building it on rock. What is the prescription for Restore Liberty on how we can and do that practically in a church, and what needs to happen in the church if we're going to make this happen?
Well, yeah, it's a good thing I was asked this same question yesterday at a speaking presentation. And I think it's time to just send the message specifically to those who work within governing agencies and say that this 501c3 IRS tax status that the churches have enjoyed for years is completely irrelevant to our desire to speak and magnify the truth and love across this country. And it's not going to be just inside the walls. It's going to be outside the walls. It's going to be loud. It's going to be courageous. And it's going to be pastors. It's going to be laymen and women. It's going to be all of us saying, that's enough. Because, and frankly, if we recognize within Restore Liberty that true liberty comes from Christ and Christ alone, and through our salvation in that regard. But we need to be out there influencing our culture and showing what a Christian is, because right now we're letting the name of Christian, and in some ways the name of Christ, be written about and painted by others freely. And we sit behind our walls, and like you said, in our previous discussions before we went live, it's a theater in many ways. And they're willing to and perfectly happy with us doing only that.
Right. They just want our money and pay their salaries and do their theatrical production and move on. See you next Sunday.
Right.
Not Sunday night, not Wednesday night, nothing in between, just once a week,
Well, and I think people follow courage. Some people are wired to lead with it. And some people see others doing steps in courage and are willing to follow in behind. And, whatever you do, whatever works for you in the end. But if this Restore Liberty movement nationwide is not led by people of faith, then I don't think it would succeed anyways. Because we first and foremost have to recognize that no matter what happens, no matter how much we think we may be in charge of something, that we are at best in a very distant second place.
Yes.
And human nature, which is something our founding fathers did their best to write into our founding documents to overcome, this desire for power and corruption and bureaucratic growth and all these kinds of things that we can see magnified pretty heavily today. That it certainly exists within the church, and oftentimes the church was part of the problem in the first place. But if you're a true Bible-believing Christian faithful person, you're going to put yourself in second place. You're going to do your best to minimize your ego, because you can't eliminate it, and move forward in the courage that is wrapped up and bounded in the fact that there's no such thing really as blind faith. There's just courageous faith, because we know that God gives us so many examples of people stepping out in faith and him always being there. And it's incredible to live that kind of life. I mean, my wife and I have lived a pretty crazy life. We've jumped off cliffs routinely, and all we really ever say is, I wonder what the color of the parachute is this time.
Right. Yeah. That reminds me of that Steve Harvey video of talking about jumping. He's at the end of or between sessions filming on Family Feud, and he does a little 5 or 6 minute just sort of ad lib speech about figuring out what you love in life, and to just jump, and just the parachute may not always open, but you just got to jump in faith and hope it turns out.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that too. I've not been involved in politics until the last few years, and it's just amazing to me the people that God has put in my life that I now have relationships with and friendships that just some of the most trusted people I've ever met. And I'm so thankful for that, but it never would have happened if I was sitting on my couch. And it seems to me we've got a whole lot of people leaning on a shovel, praying for a hole.
Oh yeah. And I'll give you a great example. And so I don't know if you've ever heard of the Reawaken series and Clay Clark and all that.
Right.
I've been to a couple of those, and that's really all you need to do, by the way. They're pretty much the same across the country.
Right.
And although I was told they didn't want me to speak at those, though I was asked to by many people to try, the message I would pass to a group like that is, if you show up here and you've got all your red, white, and blue paraphernalia on, you've got your cross necklace on, and you pick whatever that looks like, and you show up and you take part in this event for a couple days, and you go home, and that flag that you had flying on the sidewalk out front, you furl it up and stick it in the corner and wait for the next rally.
Right.
You've done yourself no good. Zero.
Right. Yeah.
And we in that practical tacticals, we wrote a thing kind of called the no rally policy. And if you're going to have a rally, whatever, that's fine. It's better to tie that to something like meet outside your Capitol building than every single one of you go inside and testify to a legislative committee and say, you know what? No more
right.
of this, whatever that topic is. And so that's part of what we call moving forward in an activism fueled by faith and knowledge that you're doing the right thing, even if you lose. Losing and winning doesn't determine right or wrong.
Well, and look, the thing people have to realize is you mentioned it earlier, John Quincy Adams, about duty is ours, results are God. Mm-hmm. God thinks on a completely different plane and perspective from us. We can't even a human can't even comprehend the way God views things and is thinking about things. And so what we view oftentimes as a loss or a failure, it doesn't necessarily mean that is, and it's if we're following God and we're doing what we're supposed to do, the results are out of our hands. And I can tell you, Rebecca has helped me realize this a lot, that people have different callings, different talents. And when I first got involved and motivated to want to do something to try to help, make a difference, boy, I would do anything and everything I could. And I just got worn out. I got involved in too many things. Started neglecting my time with work, with family, and an addiction, whether it's alcohol or golf or politics. If you do something so much that you're neglecting other important things in your life, doesn't do anyone any good. And so, I've spoken at a couple of dinners where I've told people that we need everyone to get involved from all walks of life. We need people with every talent, every kind of skill set. And so I would encourage people, and Rebecca wanted me to mention this, that you have talked about having a balance in life and following the calling that God has given you with the talents He's given you.
Yeah, and sadly, I'm actually one of the worst examples. I mean, I can say it all day long, but I have a hard time doing it. I actually quit my job that I had, very easy job ultimately for a guy that with my background, it was easy. And it provided enough income to make a difference to us in our post-retirement life. But it was encroaching on my ability to do Restore Liberty work voluntarily nationwide and travel and speak to people and things like that. And it's been extremely expensive. But I know how Satan gets at me, and it's through financial stress. And God made it very clear to me that He goes, your debts are mine. It's like, oh, well, they always have been. That is true.
That's nice to shift that off to someone.
But my question now is, well, when?
Yeah. Well.
But and I've had some good discussions with Rebecca on this too, and it's not like I needed to tell her this; she already knew it. But we always talk about God, family, country, and it's a very easy thing to say. But I like to emphasize the fact that that's actually a list of priorities with cascading results
in the right order.
Yeah. If your relationship is good with God and you bring that relationship into your family and you're both good with God, and that's a loose term. We all know that we fail daily and sin daily. Get God right, get family right, and your country will follow.
Absolutely.
That's how it started. And so what is being eroded the most? The family.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying that anybody can marry anybody for any reason whatsoever, then divorce and redo it again over and over and over again. And they keep thinking that the marriage is a contract between two people and government with tax benefits and various things like that. In reality, it's God ordained, God covenanted, and that's all it ever was. And it was never a government thing in the first place.
No.
And you got to
a driver's license might be a government thing. It's a privilege. It's not a right. But no, marriage was never. Government shouldn't have anything to do with it.
Oh, absolutely. But if you do make it a government thing, then you can use the government to circumvent and turn it into and make it a target, basically, and say, well, now we can have, anything we want for all intents and purposes. But we see that happening also within Child Protective Services as they remove kids from families, and Montana is one of the worst states for that. Everything that we see out there in schools and the grooming of children and all this kind of stuff through a lot of different venues, if you remove the family foundation right in the middle of the God family country and the family's gone,
right?
Well,
you can't bridge the gap between God and country without the family. It doesn't work.
Right. It's impossible. And then you end up with a whole lot of people who make government their God and worship there.
Yes. And stay there.
Then you have nothing at all. And in fact, I wrote an article on that called The Failure of God, which raised some eyebrows, as you can imagine. And said
is it on Restore Liberty's website or
no, I'd have to share a link, but if you go to yournews.com, it's I don't know if you can pull it up by searching my name. It sometimes that's a little weird, but some things I self-publish. But
yeah,
the essence of the argument is the fact that what you saw in people, like all the pictures we saw of the people who were crushed emotionally after Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016.
Yes. Well, and the way they're acting now with Roe versus Wade, because they lost their non-existing constitutional right. That never existed to start with.
But what you've really done is you've told them that the God they worship, that is government, has failed them.
Yes.
And so they're going to be on this weird heartbeat of up and down every time something they disagree with happens. Again, their God fails them, and sometimes their God wins, sometimes it fails. For us, when it comes to the Christian faith, we don't have to worry about that. It's us that will fail.
Right.
But the God is the everlasting rock that we can all lean on. And we don't have to worry about the circumstances that surround us, be they government, private corporation, and whatever those things are. All of them are subject to the perfect God. So we don't have to cry and wail and these kinds of things if we see something that we think has failed us. Ultimately, those people who do that, like Justice Black and others, they'll end up standing before the only person who can judge anybody on this planet.
Absolutely.
And that's not our job.
Just a matter of time.
Right. And that's why I think it's also important that, it's easy to sit back and look at the world through our Christian lens and talk about how God will judge those who do a variety of things. But we also, and this is part of a little bit what you see within the people of Restore Liberty, is that we have to be the first in line to grant grace and mercy to others who could be coming to our leadership and begging forgiveness because they didn't realize what was going on. Mm-hmm. We certainly don't deserve that from a perfect God. So who would we be to hold that back from the people who may come to us?
Absolutely.
And that's what makes us different.
Yeah. You don't hear that a lot. You don't hear people talking about grace and liberty. The common response would be, you've got this buddy you've been trying to get involved forever, and then finally something happens and he reaches out to you, and most people would say, well, man, why weren't you here 3 years ago when I was asking for your help with this or that? And that's not the right response. That's the typical response, but not the right response, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so let's look at it from the perspective of social media bashing. I mean, it's nobody's perfect, but I don't go on to any of those platforms and just tear people down or I think I'm tearing people down or whatever, because that harms the witness. And if you harm the witness, then nothing that you're doing matters.
Yeah, you can throw it all out the window at that point.
Right. Absolutely. So,
well, we were talking before we started going live. And by the way, I recognize my Stephanie, my girlfriend, came in here, and Facebook has this thing. If you don't go live like 1 second before you say you're going to go live, it'll record the broadcast, but it won't publish it until after we're done. And so you and I are actually not live, and that's why it's showing 0 viewers. But we'll upload it and publish it as soon as we get through here. So that's my fault. I'm going to start saying 9:05 instead of 9, and that way we've got a 5-minute window of opportunity. They'll still be able to see it after the fact. But so yeah, I mean, we've got to. I think the 2 biggest things, and I've got a fly in here flying around me. This happened the last episode. I think it's the same fly. He's still there. You see it? It's crazy.
Yeah, I see him. Yep.
But we talked about this in the last episode, the importance of education and education within the church. And I think that's the 2 things we've got the 2 biggest issues that we have to address in America is re-educating the American public, and both about God and civics as well. And then getting the church to re-engage in the political process like it did the entire history of our country until the 1950s, until right after World War II is when you started seeing that trend change. And that's where it starts. We've got to raise up a generation of pastors that will not worry about their 501c3 status and preach the word of God the way it should. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm agreeing. I guess what also came to mind was that the immigrant population and its makeup of today, I guess, is significantly different than what we would call around that World War II era and prior to that, when it was mostly a Western European, Western culture type of immigrant population, and that's changed a lot. And you get a lot of people coming to America from countries that may have been former communist bloc nations. By the way, they're some of the most avid fighters for freedom in this country because they see what we're doing now and recognize it.
Right.
But you also have a lot of immigrants who come here, and if they're not taught civics, they're not taught the Constitution, what it means when we talk about federalism and the 9th and 10th Amendment, what's the 14th Amendment, the 4th Amendment, the 6th, and on you go with all of these different amendments. They really have no idea when their government has stepped out of line so severely from what the contract between us and the government even says. If they don't know that, they don't know what to fight for. And so that's part of what education gets at, is it teaches them that contract. And the contract between 2 parties, if one's in violation, they're in breach. And the federal government is clearly in breach of contract with the people right now.
Absolutely. Clearly.
Everybody know that.
Yeah. And that's what, Rebecca and I have working with the Patriot Academy and teaching biblical citizenship classes. And they've got several churches in the central part of the state that are going to be starting those within the church itself. In the northern part of the state, up here where I'm at, I've got one pastor who I went to seminary with. By the way, after I finished at Ole Miss in accounting, I guess I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, so I continued my education and went to Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary. But I have one seminary pastor friend that is willing to consider, talking to the deacons in the church about teaching biblical citizenship. But every other pastor I've reached out to is just, politely. They hadn't really said no, but they hadn't said yes. It's like, well, that's, we could talk about that. We might consider that. And you can tell it's just not going anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. It's and sometimes it takes one person to step out in courage to have others follow. And we talked about this earlier, where some people are wired to not be afraid and to step out front and say, okay, follow me. Others are like, they move a little bit more pensively. And if they see one person step out in courage, then maybe they'll follow.
Yeah. Our legislators are a lot like that too, I've noticed.
Yeah.
You have somebody with the gumption to get up and say something, and all of a sudden you get what was a 52-0 vote becomes a 35-15 the opposite way or something. No one wants to be the guy that stands up in the room and speaks his mind, and we need more of that. So
absolutely. Yep.
Well, Darin, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I wish I would have hit the live button about 30 seconds faster than I did. I didn't realize Facebook was so OCD about starting on time. My clock said 9 o'clock straight up when I started it. So I guess the clock ends at 8:59 and 59 seconds if you say you're going to go live at 9 a.m. But we were talking before that you would love to come down here and talk to a group or a convention of pastors. I will tell you, I'll give you my word. I will work on that. I've got, some connections within those minister organizations and with Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary. We can make that happen. So you've got my word. If you'll work on that one thing we talked about beforehand, and I'll work on that and see if we can't get you down here. I'd love to meet you in person, and I know Rebecca and Adam and the others would love to see you. So thank you for taking time out of your day to come and visit with us. And maybe next time Steve will be here. I'm sure he'll love to have you back on when he's back in town. And he's a firecracker. He's a lot more energetic probably than I am.
I listened to him speak at the Health Freedom Rally down there that I get.
Yeah. Oh, you were down there for that? Okay. Yeah, I was there. I guess I just didn't see you. Did you speak also?
I did. Yep.
Okay. Well, but then I heard you. I just didn't put two and two together. Yeah, I was down there. That was a great event. That was a lot of fun. So
I guess I made no impact on you. I'll have to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Well, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. And we were talking about aviation earlier, and you being a pilot and me being a pilot. And I don't know if you ever had a chance to. You mentioned that you've flown for 20-something years, but you don't have an FAA pilot's license. Obviously, you know how to fly. And we had talked about the fact that Orville Wright never got a pilot's license either because he invented the thing. He didn't think he had to. But I don't know if you've heard of John and Martha King, the King training videos. Probably didn't use that in the military, but it's this. They're really corny. All right. They're really low budget made, but they have a series of training videos. If you're working on your IFR, they came out originally on VCR, cassette tapes. And anyway, he had this funny little sign off at the end. And so in honor of John King and both of our love of aviation, we appreciate you guys joining us. And in honor of John King, I'll say this, leave you with this. Keep the pointy side forward, keep the dirty side down, and please stay out of the trees.